All righty. Pursuant to, let me turn on my video. Pursuant to Governor Baker's March 12, 2020 order suspending certain provisions of the open meeting law and the governor's March 23, 2020 order imposing strict limitations on the number of people that may gather in one place, this meeting of the Yarmouth Finance Committee meeting is being conducted via remote participation. All votes during this meeting will need to be done by roll call. No in-person attendance is permitted by the public, but every effort will be made to ensure the public can adequately access and participate in the proceedings as provided for in the order. Public participation will be permitted by allowing members of the public to join this meeting via Zoom or via the telephone. Mr. Chairman, if you could just take a roll call for quorum to call the meeting into order.
A quorum and also to give permission to go and conduct the meeting in remote session, please.
So this is a vote to conduct the meeting in a remote section and to open the 6 o'clock meeting of the Yarmouth Finance Committee. Brian? Here. Sarah?
Here. Aye.
Stephanie?
Here. Aye.
Jack?
Here.
Nate?
Aye.
George?
Here. Aye.
Okay. First order of business is the minutes. Has everybody had a chance to take a look at the minutes? There's no changes?
Yeah, there are.
Okay.
Sorry, this is awkward. I have to come over here in order to speak. So I would just say on the minutes, my name is spelled inconsistently. Stephanie with an F, Cox with an H. And then also just to note that the last minutes I abstained on, that could be noted as well. And I think that's about it. Thank you.
So can I have a motion to accept the minutes as amended?
I'll make a motion. Second.
Seeing a motion, a second, no, just any discussion? Seeing none, I have a vote. Brian? Aye. Sarah?
Aye.
Stephanie?
Aye.
Jack?
Aye.
Nate?
Aye.
George?
Aye.
Aye. And I'm in favor also, unanimous. Our next item is actually to talk about financial items, but I wanted Dan to give us an update on the town and its finances. I think you have a spreadsheet you can share.
Yeah, Kyle, can you pull up, I think there was a couple of emails I sent to you late today that have some fund balances on it from articles and other sources. Not that one, another one that was sent a little bit before that one. We'll come back to that. That's it. So, this, if you haven't seen it, we'll send it out to you by email. One of the things that we keep track of is over the years, articles that were appropriated at town meetings, we keep track of, and also we keep track of the expenditures against them. Now, we have a bylaw that requires those to be expended or retired after 2 years. So if we haven't used all the funds in those that are available with funds available, then we can, when we retire them at town meeting, they return to us in free cash, okay? So one of the challenges that we have is on occasion, we let a few go beyond the 2-year limit if they've attached to complicated projects, because over the years, the department heads have gotten pretty good at chipping away at long deferred projects by asking for a little bit of money to keep like permitting going and then move into construction or some kind of demolition activity. So on occasion, I'd say probably every 6 months or so, we do a pretty good effort to review the status with each department and see where we are as it relates to expenditures within that 2-year time frame. So for instance, we've grouped what you see on the screen after the Affordable Housing Trust to buildings and grounds related articles. And there's a lot of money tied up in some of those articles. So one of the projects that I have in front of me in the near term is to meet with the Public Works Department to identify which of these projects that we still have money available for will realistically be performed this year. As you know, if you haven't heard, our superintendent of buildings and grounds, Dick Court, passed away a couple days back. And between the passage of Dick, who was a real good specialist as it relates to contracting and procurement of these relatively complicated projects, to just the delay in doing business in COVID-19, it's likely that many of these articles we're just not going to fully get to the point in a 2-year time frame where we'll expend it. So that's something we literally go by line by line and check in on that. And it's a pretty lengthy list. Kyle, if you can slide down a little bit. There's other fund sources, you can stop there. There's other sources that also are available depending upon the funding conditions. So for instance, sale of cemetery plots, we have a fund available for that. So when people make donations, it builds up there. So we are able to use some of those funds to offset the cost of the cemetery operation. There are other funds that are established as a, for instance, though I don't see it on the screen, it'll come up soon, on water conservation or conservation, what I would call it. These are on fees associated with permitting for the Conservation Commission. And when we generate a fee, it goes into account. And we use a little bit of that money to offset the salaries associated with the conservation coordinator. So we try to balance incoming money with money going out. Kyle, one of his duties is to work with the CEDC and the Tourism Preservation Fund, and there's some money available there. So as a, for instance, one of our projects this year is, over the last few years, the town has done a good job of identifying the cost of our labor as it relates to health insurance, retirement obligations, and retirement health insurance obligations, or what's referred to as OPEB. So as a, for instance, in inspectional services, the building and the health department, to some degree, a good percentage of their salaries are offset by the fees that were structured and set by the Board of Selectmen, factoring in not just their salary, but the cost of employing them, including their retirement and their health insurance and their health insurance benefit into retirement. So we do pay, for instance, I'm not sure if it's all or a portion of Kyle's salary, for instance, from the fund. So we're in the process now of identifying additional employment liabilities that we have with staff and identifying what those numbers are, and then charging them to a fund so that they are not paid by the general levy necessarily. Because if you're working and supported by a fund, that fund should not only be apportioned out for your salary when possible, but also for the loading of that salary. So when we hire somebody at $60,000, that's probably more like a $90,000 turnaround as it relates when you factor in health insurance and retirement and OPEB. So that's an ongoing effort. So the idea there is to, like we do with golf, water enterprise, is we've moved those costs over to those operations so that the fee structure can support that. So if you want to keep going. So there's quite a list. There's a lot of articles that are tied up with Department of Natural Resources for a variety of different things. And like I said, this is a very lengthy process that we go through to identify additional funds to assist with building up the entire overall budget. Now, some of these funds aren't necessarily easily accessible. So they might be a scenario where we have to appropriate the money first as part of the budget activity. And then at the end of the year, the organization or the entity that supplies the funds allows us to backfill the salary account. And that person's salary then becomes whole, and that would return back to us in free cash. So that's a bit of a limitation because we have to show that we have the cash on hand first in order to pay for somebody's position. In our Affordable Housing Trust staff member, she gets paid like that. We have to show that we have the funds available to pay her, and then at the end of the year, we're allowed to do an offset with some federal funding that is also part of her salary. So even though you see a lot of money there, sometimes there's strings attached. And but like I said, we're at an all-time high right now. I think it's pretty close as to available funds that are stored in these articles, if you will. That's Kyle, if you want to flip to that other diagram that was just up. Let's see, should be, yeah, general fund articles. So you can see at 2020, yeah, we're just a little bit under the high point of how much money is available in articles. So when we start building the budget, we'll try to draw down on those articles first before we hit the appropriation for the general fund. So this diagram here, so one of the things is, for instance, under general fund operating, that's the available cash on hand. And it's artificially high right now because we did not use free cash fully. So there's over $2.5 million accounted for in that operating fund that would have been appropriated as part of town meeting that we're holding back on. There's the roadway levy account. We haven't spent money that's like $1.3 million. And then there's the capital allocation. We haven't spent down that money. So there's another $1.5 million there. So the general fund appears to have more money in it than available, but that's more due to the fact that we're just not spending anything right now. Water capital is the water funds are also, the retained earning funds are, this is pre-DOR certification, if you will. So I think the latest time I checked that what we have available in water retained earnings is about $3.5 million. So once the DOR runs through all of our calculations, there'll be adjustments on those black numbers that you see in the actual 2020 column. Septage reserve, that's about what the number is, although we had a bit of a draw on it this year because we took out some money for some capital repairs of pretty significance. And then Bayberry Hills, when we close the book on Bass River and Bayberry Hills, we'll probably end up showing about a $300,000 plus profit from 2020 in that. But that's deceiving because in past years, we used town money probably in the tune of almost $300,000 to support the operation. So this is, if you were to, do a snapshot of how much cash does the town have right now available to it, it's not necessarily going to be spent or obligated. That's what it looks like right now.
I guess I'll open it up to any board member who wants to ask any questions of Dan regarding the financials.
Sure.
Nothing? I don't hear any, Dan, so we can probably move on.
Yeah, so the question of the night then becomes, Mary Alice from my office sent everybody some of all the documents that I shared with you over the Zoom call last time we met. They're exactly the same as they were presented the other night that we looked at. So the question that's ahead of us, I think, for tonight that you should be considered is that prior to the board setting their budgetary policy, what is it that the Finance Committee would like to take a vote on to recommend that the board consider? And, as a for instance, Robert and I have gone back and forth a little bit today. One of the approaches, and, both the board and the Finance Committee members over the years have, in the Capital Budget Committee for that matter, have expressed a concern that on some big ticket capital items, much of it is related to the seawall infrastructure, we've kicked the can down the roads. Now, one of the problems we've had, frankly, is it's hard to do something different when you don't have any significant new sources of revenue coming in and you're running deficits because one of the liabilities in your line item keeps growing. And with that, I refer to as the DY agreement. As long as we were up against a scenario where we were in like year after year after year of budget overrides, it would be really hard to finance doing something significant with these liabilities in a way in which wouldn't hurt some other aspect of what we needed to finance, because the pot of money is finite, okay? However, the trend has indicated in this last budget cycle that pre-COVID-19, depending upon how the Board of Selectmen decided the final budget would look like, there was going to be a little bit of excess levy capacity potentially that you could apply towards debt service if you wanted to fund a long-term obligation, like say a bond for 10 years for a seawall improvement. Now that's a policy and a political decision as to what you could do, but you know, and I'll just ballpark the numbers for you, but say you have $3 million of renovations that you want to make. And well, I should make it easier to do that. If you have 5 million and you wanted to borrow for that, the rate of borrowing was so low. You know, if you had a 5-year note, you would be paying the principal and a little bit of interest. Maybe on that you'd be paying $1,050,000 a year, $1,500,000, say, or something like that. So that's not going to work because we wouldn't have that kind of availability in the levy if everything held like it did last year as it relates to how much was available. But say we could open up maybe enough for a $300,000 payment. So maybe instead of borrowing $5 million in 5 years, you borrow $3.5 million over 10 years, and you work that payment cycle into an obligation within the budget. So then that becomes more manageable and we could make that payment. And then as time goes on and you develop some additional levy capacity, you could certainly add some borrowing. We don't have a lot of debt available in the budget now. It's in the neighborhood of about $360,000. So when that comes off the books, I mean, you can do a little bit with that. But the idea would be is to, you know, we have $1.5 million carved out of the levy for routine and regular capital. It would be nice to be able to have a little bit of a carve out in the levy, $300,000 to $500,000, say, for more longer term capital items. And then once you get it installed in there as a budget liability, it ends up being appropriated from year over year because you have to pay it. So it becomes the number one priority to be obligated. So it's that kind of political and policy decision that would need to be made in order for us to chip away at some of these long-term kick the can capital items. Now, the likelihood that we get any new revenue sources right now, short of like a wholesale fire sale on property or something, say the town owns, is pretty slim. Now, we do have an opportunity to bring in some additional revenue from Workshop Road, 50 Workshop Road. We have a request for proposal for development concepts that down the line could yield us anywhere from a lease payment from $50,000 to maybe $150,000 or more. But that's really preliminary. So you wouldn't want to bank on that. But that's certainly an example of how it is that you can generate a pretty significant revenue stream for many years to pay for some of these liabilities. And we're mindful of trying to find other opportunities to do something like that. And we'll bring those to your attention as we find them. But right now, under the COVID-19 scenario, our most promising, what I'd call relatively new revenue source was going to be short-term rentals. But I can't, with any degree of confidence, give you any projection as to what that looks like because of the situation that we're in now. So this is now a time that if you're going to model a projection, and what I would do is look to work with Finance Committee and Capital Budget to identify as a model those long-term capital items you'd like to see if we could finance actually plug in some real life projects into a calculation for borrowing and see what kind of money we would need to generate to pay for that obligation. And now's the time to do something like that while we're preparing the budget. A lot of times we get these great ideas to do something at the end of the budget process. And by that time, the money's already spoken for and it's obligated, and there's not much I can do to change that. So I throw that out there as a starting point, as a discussion tonight as to how you'd want to approach the board, maybe some generic statement along the lines of the Finance Committee supports the concept of borrowing, using new revenue sources or potentially available levy sources to pay for some of these obligations. And at this level, you don't need to provide a huge specific number on that. It's just more a matter of if that's the policy of the Finance Committee, that gives the Board of Selectmen something to consider as they go forward. And as part of the preparing for the budget and the budget message, we would give them some examples of some of the projects, if you will, that if we had that kind of authorization, we could go forward on. So.
Again, I would like to avoid any questions for Dan.
And is there a list of some of these big projects that we could tackle?
Yeah, so I believe in what I sent to you, there was the capital budget, the entire capital budget documents that they reviewed last year. Let me just pull that up and see real quick here. You know, understanding that some of these projects, like the revetment walls, they most of them, you know, that kind of infrastructure hasn't even gotten to design yet. And so what normally happens is you can borrow for design work. Sometimes it's better to pay cash on that. But if you did borrow for design work, you can carry a note and pay principal only for usually no problems, no questions asked for 2 years. But after that, it gets a little dicey, and the borrowers that you're getting money from would like to have some fractional equivalent of principal being paid. But again, we've been carrying the debt for golf on a short-term note for a number of years now, with the idea that actually we might end up paying it off before it ever goes to a long-term conversion. But it does recognize it does take a long time to sometimes bring these projects to construction.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm trying to pull up the capital budget recommendations sheet here. Well, so as a, for instance, capital budget had 1.5 million roughly of projects that were withdrawn or not recommended. And they came in the neighborhood as a, for instance, Lewis Bay flushing study is $120,000 estimate. Now that's not a bad free cash candidate. It would just be a matter of, if you didn't want to go that route, would you bundle it with some other seafront related work activities or activities? But there was like DY School had one for energy management at 281,726. And you're going to see a fair number of those requests are in these like soft applications. Some of it's computer related. Software is a big one these days. The police department had a request of $275,000, and the way software goes, it doesn't have much of a life longer than 5 years. So that, you know, you could bond that way, but I mean, you're starting to see we have more asks than we have cash sources available to pay for. on the 10-year plan, a big one for us to consider is obviously what to do with Bass River Country Club. There's going to be some infrastructure upgrade if DHY passes. But even if it does pass, there's still going to be some enhancements that the town could make to the golf course. Sandy Pond is still out there, although that would be Community Preservation Act typical as it relates. Other one that we discussed recently with the board is fire station, a combined fire station in the central part of town, letting us close down Station 1 and 2, which are about 50 plus years old and pretty much at the end of their life expectancy, but for a lot of different reasons. One new modern station makes sense for massing of your firefighter resources that puts more firefighters in one station to help alleviate some of the call volume problems that we have. Carl and Natural Resources has one. I don't know much about this situation, but it's referred to as Run Pond Revitalization at 3.7 million. And then he has a general category of coastal infrastructure repairs and improvements, $15.4 million. And what I could get for you as a, for instance, is his number one priorities in that topic. So the problem is because these numbers are so large, it seems to be like there's been paralysis on doing anything because nobody kind of wanted to step out. And I understand that with the situation with the DY budget being what it was, it's very hard to try to address these issues. But we do have this window of opportunity now potentially where we could start moving on a few things. We just gotta, I think our job as administration is to present it to you in bite-sized morsels so that it becomes more manageable, because clearly nobody's gonna go out and spend $15.5 million and issue a bond for 10 years on coastal infrastructure repairs or improvements. That's just unaffordable. But certainly within that, there's projects that we could probably begin to take a look at. So the first thing would be, once we do some preliminary budget projections, is to find out how much excess levy capacity could be applied against the borrowing. And then from there, we could decide, based on what was presented to you, what would make sense. And this is one of those things where I give the example in Westfield where I came from. Back in the 1990s, interest was a very large component of borrowing, much more problematic than it is today. And in fact, maybe back then, 65% of the expenditure on a note was related to interest payments. But the city back then had carved out within its operating budget about $5 million to pay for recurrent capital needs. So 20 years later, that number, inflation being what it is and the budget being larger than what it was 20 years before, by the time I arrived in the city hall in running the show in 2010, we were managing that capital allocation between $7 and $9 million. So that's like the forever gift. So that goes on, and as projects fall off the debt schedule, the obligation of any successive set of policymakers is to make sure that they're reloading, if you will, the capital needs and using that money to pay for that. The mistake that organizations would make is that, like, we've run down our debt service here in town, and now we don't have that available to pay for any obligations because nobody put any new obligations in front of the town meeting. That's a bit of a challenge to kind of go and reverse that cycle. So I think if we do that kind of deliberately in small chunks, we'll be able to, in a few years from now, be able to get a number that's in a line with enough that we can address some of these long-term liabilities to us. So it's complicated for sure, but you have to start somewhere. And I would propose to the Finance Committee that we recommend to the Board of Selectmen beginning that process, if possible, this year in the budget planning.
So, Dan, just a couple of questions. You have been referencing this document. There were a lot sent out today. Are you talking about the Capital Budget Committee FY21 recommendations PowerPoint?
Yeah.
And are you talking about us looking at the things that were already recommended? Or are you talking about looking at
Well,
the
these don't
request
change.
withdrawn
Yeah.
or not recommended and things on the 10-year capital facility plan?
Yeah, since I've been here, these haven't changed. These continue to appear on the list and they just don't ever get moved. And so what you'll see when we go through this process again, for the 5 and the 10 year, and then typically for the requests withdrawn or not recommended, these things will reappear because it's been an interesting exercise where the departments go ahead and they pitch this to capital budget and it ends up being sidelined for a lot of different reasons. So
again, just to clarify, we're looking at specifically things that were withdrawn or not recommended only, or also looking at things
if you
that
look
would be
at
on the 10-year capital plan?
if you look at requests withdrawn or not recommended in the 10-year capital plan, that's more like where these requests would come from. These are the bigger ticket items.
Thank you.
You know, the schools are a little bit problematic right now only because we don't know where the future is on those. So, you know, it's hard to predict spending any money at ME Small when we don't know what its future is. That's a more complicated discussion. But, you know, certainly some of those items on the 10-year plan, they just appear there year after year after year. So,
So Dan, does anyone else have another question for Dan? Seeing none. Dan, so I think what you're looking for us is maybe to make a motion along the lines of that the finance committee is in favor of bonding for short-term, not long-term debt, but short-term debt to address some of the capital items that have been pushed off for decades.
yeah, I would say that the language along that line that, you know, that the finance committee supports, I'd say like future budget planning that would include various borrowing. I'm just typing as we go along just so I can write it down. Various borrowing vehicles and identifying, and this is the key, folks, recurring receipts to pay for that borrowing. So right now, for instance, nobody has claimed ownership of any of the potential receipts that could come from 50 Workshop Road. So if we're successful in developing a agreement, that would be new money coming into the budget. If you have this as a recurrent policy recommendation to the board, then I can begin to plan that, knowing that whatever sum of money, the first priority for it is to use it to pay against these long-term capital items that we'd have to identify what they are so that you know what they are, but that would at least identify a new source of revenue. But the key is recurring receipts. So if you open up space in the levy, that's also a recurrent receipt.
Can
So
I,
yeah,
can I stop us for a minute? I'm frustrated, I guess. Maybe I'm hearing this in Stephanie's questioning also, but, I spent a lot of years assuming the principle of whether we borrow or not is whether the return on the project exceeds the cost of financing.
right.
And I don't hear that being expressed at all. We got some goddamn list that has some items on it that may or may not have any value. But for whatever reason, political or otherwise, we've not done anything about it. But I don't hear anybody talking about whether those specific items have an estimated return associated with them.
Well,
For
give me a
example,
for instance, George.
Well, I'm going to give you one which I know something about. We're thinking of borrowing for the water resource, the putting in of phase one of the wastewater project.
Right.
And there's a substantially large borrowing potentially involved there. And we're making a decision whether or not we proceed on that based on the fact that we don't affect the tax rate. I'm a little bit lost about that.
Yeah, that
Well,
was a policy decision, George.
No, I realize that, but I don't understand the rationale for such policy. That's where I'm going.
Well, so like,
If we're in a- if we're- let me
Well, let me
finish.
just address that one, because that's a unique one.
If
So-
we're in a time in which the rate of borrowing is so low,
Yes.
and we're still suggesting we might not pursue that project. Now, I would argue, even the most conservative estimates would argue that the returns on that project alone would be someplace north of 10%. And we're going to be able to borrow for 30 years. It's something less than
Oh, no question.
5%.
Oh, no, probably even.
Why are we even talking about this?
Yeah. Well,
Uh,
let me just address that one, because that is one that where you can better understand the rationale. So in 2011, when that went to a ballot, the plan back then for cost recovery was to move it as a debt exclusion. And it failed at the ballot pretty significantly. And the rationale behind that, and again, it's a big project. It's 4 phases over.
No, I'm on the Water Resource Advisory Committee.
Right, so
I
you know the story. So the issue was, when you needed to go that route and get a ballot question, in this particular instance, over the next 10 years, a very small percentage of people, many of which aren't even voters probably, would benefit from it. And folks that went to the polls were like, I'm never going to see a benefit here. I'm not even in that area that needs this problem. So that's where that strategy on that particular topic, the marching orders for future administration was, we'll go down this road again, but you got to find a way to do it that doesn't move it to the property tax levy. And that's why so much energy and effort was put into the short-term rental tax and the development of the Water Protection Trust, because those represented for the first time significant new revenue sources that could prop up a borrowing. And that's why town administration.
I understand all these political issues.
Yeah.
My point is that I'm looking at a list of projects that
Yep.
have no rate of return associated with them.
Well, a lot of government stuff doesn't, though, George. You know,
I'm sorry, what?
a lot of what we do in government doesn't. Like, look at all the historical buildings that we renovate and spend a lot of money on. You know, look at all the parks and playgrounds that we spend money on, borrowing money. You know, a lot of the infrastructure that government supports, it's the benefit isn't the cash equation necessarily, like you would see on a wastewater or drinking water system.
Well, I'm going to argue in federal projects, there's an expectation there's some sort of cost-benefit analysis done. And I realize the bullshit that goes into that, but nonetheless, it's a practical attempt to try to suggest that there are benefits, and those converted to some estimated rate of return. And we know what the cost of borrowing is. And we ought to be able to make that argument to logical voters that that's beneficial to them. And yet I don't see that, that happening here.
Well, yeah. So what I didn't want to do, George, to your point, is spend a lot of our limited resources planning for an offering to go to town meeting on projections in which there isn't even a consensus that we would want to use a vehicle like this to pay for it. So, significantly a departure from our traditional pay things with cash as you go is going to be the pump house rehabilitation project for this fall that will line up for town meeting. So there's an example of 12 projects totaling a number of millions of dollars that all need to get done, and they're long overdue. We can't do them all with the cash on hand. The only way you can do them all and get an economy of scale by bidding it out that way is through borrowing. And how are you going to pay for that? Well, we're going to pay for that through recurrent receipts received on water fee structure. So that's a departure from normal business, but that's something we had ready to go, because that was clearly, if we don't make that investment into those pump houses, then if the water shuts off, we got a serious problem in town.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. So some of these other things, though, are
I
a little bit more
very easily
problematic
argued.
to get to the same level of, we all know to some degree, like on coastal infrastructure and repairs, I can get you a laundry list that tallies that $15 million. But as long as floodwater isn't crashing up along the roadways, a lot of folks don't want to spend any money for that, you know?
Dan, I understand the frustration of trying to convince people that some of these projects are in their best interests. And I guess that's the obligation of town representatives to make those cases. But I'm just, my frustration is here. We're talking about these projects that have been languishing on lists for year after year, and we need to be able to finance them. We're in a situation in which the borrowing costs are rapidly going to zero, and yet we're not doing them.
Well, because I'm trying to get to the level of support that we can begin to entertain doing those. And this first step is by having language in a policy. That's my own personal belief. I haven't been in this form of government now going into my 4th year, that whatever the Board of Selectmen comes out as a policy, those are my marching orders to build the budget. So if nobody ever raises some of this long-term stuff to that level to be paid attention to, it's always going to appear on the 10-year list to just not get done. That's just the way it is, you know? So we're trying to change that dynamic a little bit and help change the dynamic as it relates to, well, you know, they've said to us, how can you get some of this stuff done? Well, this is my recommendation to start getting it done. We'll allow policy to at least entertain borrowing that's not a debt exclusion, that's different than paying cash like we've been used to doing for years and years, that allows us to get to these things done with some borrowing. But the key for us is, can we open up revenue sources to pay for that borrowing? So what those projects are as individuals, George, we'd have to present those as priorities to the capital budget, and they'll percolate those up. But we got to start somewhere.
And I see it as you try to make a mechanism for funding these expenses is basically what our first step is right now, right?
Yeah, I mean, you know, one of the scenarios that when you run a municipality, you got to be acutely mindful of is when you get locked up into some of these labor negotiations, labor organizations will always tell you that you have an obligation to pay your people, and that's true. However, you also have an obligation to take care of the assets and the holdings of the taxpayers at large. So when you go into a scenario where you're not as generous as the unions believe that you should be on salary offerings, one of the areas that they'll look at is what are your obligations to the rest of the assets within the town or city that you operate in, and what's your plan for paying for those. So it's a large degree, if a town or community never identifies these other liabilities and doesn't start addressing them, then true to form, the labor organizations will tie you up, and they'll tell you, well, you know, they're not addressing those anyway, so at least that extra money that's coming in from property tax allocation should go towards paying our salaries. And this is a real problem. So in a community like this, where we have a significant backlog of capital infrastructure repair, and we don't presently have a strategy in place to pay for it, when we can't sit at the table, because police and fire department unions, they're the only two union groups that can arbitrate with you. One of the proof of payment on a contract would be what's your other obligations in town. And so to the extent possible, we want to make sure that we're paying mindful attention to the infrastructure that the taxpayers support, and we're paying our people, but there's a balance you got to strike. So we got to get on the board here and start making that balance. So
Stephanie has a couple of questions, Dan.
Hey there, Dan. So first, I just want to say, in conceptually, I support this idea. And to George's point about kind of the cost and versus the the what the payoff is, I think we also need to look at it through the lens of what is the cost of doing nothing. Wastewater being a prime example. If we don't do it and Conservation Law Foundation is saber rattling yet again about, suing towns on the Cape. And we get a big hype solution from a federally appointed judge. That's going to cost the taxpayers a lot more money. So I think that's an important thing that for us to be articulating to the taxpayers when it comes to this type of thing. I want to be clear as far as what our choices are here. So going back to the room in the tax levy that we have, and forgive me because I'm new and I'm still just trying to understand this, but we wouldn't have the option of using that to backfill costs associated with a loss in revenues from the state or other sources, would we?
So this is kind of the challenge that we're in right now. So we are in a state that we have predicted that will have a significant local loss and a state revenue loss. So right now, I can't tell you with any degree of certainty building the next budget what kind of levy capacity we have available. But what I do know that we need to use the time that we have available now to put the plan together such that if it turns around, and it will turn around at some point, that we're ready to go. Because if we don't plan now, by the time we're ready to go, when things turn around, we'll be even that further behind the 8 ball, for instance.
The reason I'm asking this is I don't want to tie our hands in terms of being able to move around funds, when it comes to funding essential services.
Yeah, so our liabilities will also get paid for first. Just so you know, the focus right now has been on, because we lost so many jobs in 2010, is to hang on to as many full-time equivalent positions as possible. We did have a pretty significant furlough and layoff associated with part-timers, and the vast majority of them, with the exception of maybe 1 or 2, are still laid off. So that's a real loss for those folks. That's a loss for the town for sure. But that's how you pay it. Whatever liabilities you have in front of you right now, they have to get obligated. So we have contracts with the collective bargaining, we have health insurance, utilities, that all gets paid for. So if it gets really bad, and we were talking about that with the board last spring, if we don't have a pretty significant cushion by closing out old articles and being very conservative with the cash flow that we have on hand today, the next step is you gotta start cutting back human beings, and that's a problem.
And
Yeah,
I think that number one thing, like George is saying, is we got to put the sewer pipes down 28 while we can, because if the state blacktops before we get there, we can't do anything for 5 years.
right.
How are we going to fund that?
So in Springtown meeting, we did get authorization from the voters to borrow up to $5.2 million to pay for an effort that may include the Route 28 participation with DOT. So the question is what are the sources of revenue that would be used once we decide to borrow into that? So right now, we told the voters at the town meeting that was not going to be financed through a debt exclusion. So what we're going to need to do is to ensure that if local receipts that were originally planned for wastewater don't materialize, and we start borrowing against that authorization, we'll need to come up with money within the levy to pay for that. So it was an incredibly challenging tightrope, because we needed that vote at town meeting to be a DOT participant. Yet at the same time, we're predicting a free fall in our revenue receipts that we're going to pay for all things wastewater.
Yeah.
So we haven't borrowed against that yet. We have some additional funds from past articles that we continue to use to pay for design efforts associated with that work. But it's conceivable that within the next 18 months, we're going to need to borrow from that. And I have to be mindful of making sure that whatever we incur on a borrowing, we have an ability to pay for that. So, I mean, the next 12 to 18 months is highly problematic as it relates to projecting any scenario as it relates to what future revenues look like. So
Yeah.
I wanted to use this opportunity to put in place the frameworks such that if we at least start the planning process, I can go and prospect out, to George's point, those specific projects of high degree of return. And one of them might be, or a couple of them, the seawall related projects and the what if scenario. The state is financing an awful lot of resiliency seawall related efforts. And so they usually have some sort of match requirement. So if we're ready to go and apply for a grant and have funding available to match it, that's even better. But what's problematic to me is year after year, just not preparing to do something like that and kicking the can down the road, you know? So that's what I'm trying to avoid that cycle, because that's what it's setting up to do again.
Yeah. But like George is saying though, and Robert can certainly attest to, if we put that pipe down 28, our income from the businesses and stuff like that are gonna help pay for it.
I'm absolutely convinced, because anywhere a sewer pipe goes, it becomes wildly popular. The problem is you've got to have enough money to support the time period between design, installation, and when you're going to get some money. So right now, because we're probably going to end up having to push off DHY to next spring's town meeting, the agreement language, a proposed opening of the plant in 2025 now becomes 2026. So that's another year out. That's more inflation. That's more dollar values. The other thing that's in the works there is Bass River was supposed to start work on that like in 2023. That now becomes 2024, because all that effluent recharge location has to be installed and ready to go by the time the plant opens up. Otherwise, there's nowhere to put it. So that in and of itself, to reforecast the vehicles that we were going to use to pay for that, is going to be a challenge because of the scenario that's playing out on our streets. So I agree with everything that you've said, though, Nate and George, as it relates. There's no question in my mind, if that pipe gets put in, whether it's 2025 or 2026, it'll be paying great dividends by 2030 and beyond. There's no question in my mind. Absolutely. We just got to find a way to get there and pay for it.
So Dan, I want to back up and see if this board is prepared to make any type of a motion to support what you're talking about as far as short-term borrowing to address some of those issues. And George, I'm not skipping wastewater. I think we'll talk about that next and do an endorsement of that, because I don't doubt that there's 100% or a lot of support with wastewater from the finance committee too. I think these are parallel type of discussions.
I just want to clarify. So Dan, are you talking about borrowing period, or are you talking about borrowing with some kind of pay for, or borrowing with some kind of pay for and a combination of that, and using some of the categories that you started off this conversation with of free cash, some, funds that are dropping off that we have a little bit of room in the tax levy to pay for? I'm trying to understand the mechanics of what you're proposing.
So let me give you a for instance. So this is the way I wrote this up. The Finance Committee supports future budget planning that would include various borrowing vehicles and identifying recurring receipts to pay for that borrowing, including recently proposed water department pump building rehabilitations that would use ratepayer income to pay for that borrowing. That's like a level of detail that I can provide on that particular topic, because that's in front of us right now and we know that. So we're in the process of in the next couple of meetings, we'll put the rate schedule in front of the Board of Selectmen as it relates. There's all of this water capital that needs to be done, and the rate structure over the next X number of years needs to be balanced to pay for that. And so that's what we're in the process of figuring out now. So all I'm looking for is a very high level concept that just simply says we support future borrowing or budget planning that includes borrowing activities. However, that must be paid for by an identified recurring vehicle, whatever that vehicle is. It doesn't have to be identified today, because this is just a high level policy document. But without something like that to guide policy, we'll end up with something that says what we say now, which is to take care of the things that are in front of you. Don't go more than 2.5%, pay your contracts, pay your electric light utilities and all that stuff. You know, that's just really nuts and bolts related stuff. That doesn't give me any flexibility to go down the road of some creativity to address some of these items. Like, you know, I'm down right now as a, for instance, 3 department heads. And that's a lot of labor in a small organization. And I'm acutely aware of wasting people's time on things that would never get supported either by the finance committee, the board of selectmen, and certainly if it doesn't get those supports, it will never make it past town meeting. So we have to, you know, we're in this time period now that we can be a little bit creative on a few things to look at some things, but we have to know where we need to be going and spending our time. So like if we go in front of capital budget this year with some of these very specific projects, one of my instructions to staff will be is to make sure you go with capital budget with a proposed plan on how to pay for it. Because going to capital budget with just simply saying, I need this, without any way of tying in how to pay for it, is going to end up with what we got now. So,
Dan, I think, you know, this is getting somewhat semantics. I agree with you wholeheartedly. You know, the projects we've talked about are ones in which there is some revenue associated with them. Think of the water department projects or the potential valuation improvement that results from putting in sewers. So sure, those are things we can identify. But what happens when we get to the classic public goods problem that provides better amenities for those who live in the town, but there's no revenue associated with it?
so let me give you that one. So the legislature in Massachusetts addressed that by giving you the CPC. So all these organizations over the years that support affordable housing, historic structures, open space acquisition and recreation never really got the bandwidth, if you will, to get on different town or community budget priorities to take care of that infrastructure, right? Like you think like pickleball, right? You look across the town and all this tennis infrastructure, hardly anybody plays tennis anymore, right? So the legislature gave towns the option to go to the ballot and adopt this surcharge that they themselves could identify how they want to spend the money. And in fact, here in town, over the last 24 months that I've been in town, and Robert knows because he was part of it, Nate was around for sure, Brian was around for some of it, and it was the battle about using these funds to rehab some of our park and playground infrastructure. And what we saw with pickleball out of nowhere, that advocacy group came in and they started with the finance committee, well, the rec commission, they developed grassroots support for their concept there. And then they came to finance committee and it got a little heated there. But in the end, what do we got today? We got 10 beautiful pickleball courts that they were expensive and probably north of $300,000, I think, if I recall correctly. They're wildly popular for now, much like the hula hoop was in the 50s. But I can't tell you what it's going to be like 5 or 6 or 7 years from now when it starts getting cracks on it and somebody's got to pay to fix it. And CPA funds can't be used for maintenance, but it sure can be used to build nice new things, you know? So that's kind of like the conundrum that we got here, George, you know? And
I'm not arguing you don't. I fully appreciate that.
yeah, I do think if you were to ask me, like, from a priority perspective, knowing what I know about the call volume deficit that we've got with YFD, that we have more call volume by and large than we have labor to address it. Personally, my own thought would be to move quickly within, when I say quickly, I'm talking government time here, 10 years or more, on getting a new station centrally located to close out 1 and 2, but mostly to mass the resources that we have available, because even though we just hired 4 staffers, 4 paramedics, we actually needed to hire 12 to make a modest reduction in that call volume problem. we're never in this market ever going to be able to hire 12 more firefighters. But if we put them all in one station, combined in two, we could take care of two, what I'd call, taxing old facilities and get more bang for our buck out of that one place. And that, to me, that's a debt exclusion for sure, but that's something that addresses three problems: labor, old buildings, and modern flood-proof, hurricane-proof infrastructure. And but in the end, what's the return on investment? I'll tell you what, if you have a heart attack and you get a paramedic highly trained there within a few minutes, that's all the pay you need, right? So that I can tell you from that to me in this town would be a number one priority. Some people would argue that it isn't, but knowing what I know about your call volumes, they're only going up. We've got more plans for more affordable units. That's going to bring more calls. And we got no way of paying for more labor beyond what we got right now. Just can't get there from here.
I think to George's point, though, I mean, community preservation funds are not going to pay for police station carpeting.
That's right.
Please. So that either needs to be funded through that, amount in the levy that we have, or we need to be looking at this as part of a multi-pronged strategy to, be looking at borrowing and sometimes not having a pay for associated with it, or, not being able to justify that in some fashion. But I think at this point, we're probably ready to make a motion. So Dan, you said you had some language, right?
Yeah, so it's a real broad. It's the finance committee supports future budget planning that would include various borrowing vehicles and identifying recurring receipts to pay for that borrowing. Nothing more than that, just broad in order to address our backed up backlog, we would need to consider borrowing as part of our financial strategy.
We want to add to address capital items, and it's basically all capital items at this point, right?
Yeah, that's all. That's exactly it, right?
Okay, capital items. As long as it says capital in there, I'm good.
So moved.
Second.
All right, we have a motion and a second. I'm going to take any other comments. Seeing none, take a roll call vote. Brian? Aye. Sarah?
Aye.
Stephanie?
Aye.
Jack?
Aye.
Nate?
Aye.
George? Thinking, George? Is
Yeah, aye.
that a yes? Or you're still thinking about it?
No, that's an aye.
Okay, and then I'm in favor too. Now, George, we can go into wastewater now, which I had to plan on. My situation with wastewater is I think the selectmen are definitely on board with what's going on with wastewater.
Yeah, will give you a quick update on that. So we're going back and forth with our town council and Dennis and Harwich's town council on the DHY special act legislation. So there's a bit of a disagreement between the lawyers that if Harwich does not participate, the Dennis and Harwich lawyers believe that the special act legislation does not need to be amended. Our town council believes, based on his read of the special act legislation, it does. So one of the things that make life a lot easier, if we could get some sort of positive statement from the Harwich Board of Selectmen indicating that they continue to support the concept of DHY and would put forward in front of the voters at Springtown meeting the agreement that supports it, then we can feel confident about moving forward. There's some degree of concern that if Harwich isn't part of it, we might not engender support. And actually, this came out of Dennis a little bit too, that factors that are not pleased with the way the school negotiations went, we might not be able to in either town get a positive vote on an agreement if it's just the two of us. Now, that being said, all of the financial related considerations to operate DHY or to get that off the ground, informally, the town's administrations which we'll have a meeting on tomorrow, but from informal talks or conversations that have occurred with individuals, everybody's kind of good with the idea that anything that could potentially cause a town to incur money, let's push that off into the spring. So if that were to be the case, and we'll have to get to the Board of Selectmen on that sooner rather than later, but if that were to be the case, what is it at this fall town meeting that Yarmouth could do? And one of the things we could do is put in front of town meeting voters the CPA $100,000 exemption. So on your first $100,000 property, nobody has to pay the surcharge on that. And then also at the same time, create the wastewater infrastructure investment fund at town meeting. We asked for that to be passed. And then a corresponding dollar value, and I want to remember, if I remember correctly from the conversation, something like 0.78% surcharge to begin funding that. The idea there was that with the $100,000 discount from the exemption, that is almost a wash, and it's not exactly a wash one for one on every parcel of property, but it's close. That could be used to fund the wastewater infrastructure piece. However, even though you go to town meeting, and if that's favorable, doesn't cost anybody any money at that time, it still needs to go to town election. And you need to have 35 days between town meeting and town election. So if we waited for spring to do that, we wouldn't have enough time to put it on the spring ballot to have it take place then. So towns that have successfully done this have typically introduced it at one cycle, like in the fall, for an election cycle in the spring. So that would be, right now, as I see it, the best we're probably going to be able to do on wastewater for this year.
Are you looking for some type of, again, vote or encouragement from the finance committee along those lines?
Well, I would, knowing what you know about that, I would say that we could have some language along the lines of the finance committee supports continuing with the DHY partnership as the most cost-effective way and benefit to the town. That being said, we believe that measures needed to plan for the future payment of that should be undertaken at this fall town meeting. And those might include the exemption on the CPA and the install or the creation of the wastewater infrastructure trust fund. Getting that done now at town meeting sets it up for a town election cycle next spring.
I don't know if the board has a liking to that idea, but I do, but I would only ask them, maybe we don't even say DHY, because I'm actually in favor of Yarmouth moving forward in wastewater, even if Dennis or Howard don't get together with us. So I would leave it even opener.
Well, Robert, to that point, we've always been kind of flexible about co-planning this thing such that our design structure could just be Yarmouth only, and nothing prevents us from signing future agreements with neighbors to do like what they did up in Mansfield. It was the Mansfield plant in Norton and Foxborough eventually signed in on IMAs on that plant. So that is definitely a possibility. I don't think there's enough flow volume in Dennis alone, for instance, that would support Dennis doing a plant on their own. So they become a natural partner, I think, for us if we were to forge ahead with our own plant, because together it solves their problem. And Harwich is only 15% under the best of circumstances with DHY. So they need to do something, but unless Chatham opens up more capacity, which I've been of the understanding that they're not going to, there's no easy way for Harwich to solve their problems, short of tapping a pipe and sending it through Dennis to get to us if we were to build a facility at Buck Island Road. I mean, that continues to still be an option, Robert.
Right. So the only thought that I have, one thing on the CPA reduction of the $100,000 exemption, it's only good for the first $350,000 of value. If you own a home that's worth more than $350,000 or $400,000, then you will actually see an increase.
Yeah,
On that math. So
that's correct.
You know that.
Yeah.
The value of the home, it only protects the first 350, 400,000. The only other thing I had, which on that particular issue, which is now mixed wastewater and CPA, But I actually would consider, if anybody wanted to make a motion, that we consider deferring CPA for a couple of years as a second motion. Now, I know Dan, most people are not in favor of this, but it follows George's concept, which is if we could get wastewater online and start getting the funds in there and starting to get commercial real estate tax base up, postponing that would offset any of these other increases. And in the long run, will actually help the town substantially. Growth of all the Route 28 strip, it actually helps housing, because if you have sewer, your housing costs go down dramatically too. So, and again, these other process, the other four things that we do, open space, historic, recreation, they actually cost the town funds in the future to support. So every buck we spend out of the CPA does come with kind of a baggage for the town financially. And I also have to question how much the state is actually going to chip in on their matching funds.
Yeah.
Considering 2000, what's going on with them, I think that state matching funds are going to be pretty lame.
Could it be zero?
It could be zero.
Could be zero, right?
Yeah, I think though they're propping up matching funds with
Yeah, there's a sort
deed receipts at the registry of deeds. So when real estate transactions get done, and they've been pretty robust, that
Yeah.
there'll be some money.
for CPC. So I want to understand a little bit clearly what you're saying. What are you saying to pause on CPA with, like spending anything on it, or the $100,000?
Freeze the 3% tax for 3 to 5 years and allow the taxpayers a relief of that, and then bring it back after 3 to 5 years, depending on
And
the
bring up
town's
the WIF,
economics condition.
and you're suggesting bring up the WIF by that much?
Oh,
The wastewater infrastructure fund?
oh yeah, to bring them in basically at the same time, so that we start seeing the increase of the wastewater costs and the drop off of the CPA fund.
So it's
that
essentially
the taxpayers don't feel any more hit.
Right.
And I don't know how, I actually don't know how much, discomfort there is out there from the taxpayers. I assume, based on COVID and everything else, that we're not all looking at, a great financial year for most of us. So I was considering offering up a relief to the taxpayers and saying, it's your money, it's your 3%. If you want to withhold it for 3 years, then do so. Hold it for 5, do so. But I like to give options to the taxpayers, because I truthfully don't know how much pain they're in. When we lose an override or something like that, what do they say? I don't like the override, or I don't have the money. I don't know.
Well, I think it would be important to know what kind of funding requests are coming before the CPC at this point in time, because I would imagine it's going to, there are requests for, programs that would help people in these times here in town. So I think that's an important consideration to bear in mind.
So we're talking about a wastewater support, a support for the $100,000 exemption. And if the rest of the board has any consideration for it, just to say, continue to research the idea. Would the town be favorable to a break of 3 to 5 years of the CPA? Just investigate it at this point. That's my thoughts.
Dan, can you speak to that at all, though?
Would be
What
like
kind of
one-
requests
yeah,
have come before the
One motion, two
CPC?
thoughts.
We won't know for sure until the application period starts, and I know they're trying to reconfigure themselves so that they can start taking applications in the fall season to coincide with approval at fall town meeting. That being said, there was a number of items that were either, if I remember correctly, half funded or deferred due to the circumstances that we were in with the budget right now. Maybe it's in the neighborhood of $4 to $6 million potentially is the total scenario. I think one of the strategies that the water resources and George help me here, the planning committee and they were trying to engender stakeholder support across a variety of mutually interested stakeholders, and the idea of enlisting folks that were advocates of CPC and open space preservation was more of a strategy decision to invite them into the tent as opposed to cut them out of the tent, because then you kind of know going into town meeting that they were going to speak against the dismantlement of their program. So we tried to strike the best balance by coming up with or bridging the gap of the funding shortfalls with this creative solution about the $100,000 exemption and being a little bit more creative with going after the Water Protection Trust. But it would be true to say that the entire scenario was a delicate alliance of forces of, I think there's a mutual desire to get this done, but how we got it done is a differing strategy. Nobody wants to give up anything on their own. So
Well said, Dan.
I try, George. Thank you.
Yeah, I would agree. I think that, I mean, I like the creativity, Robert. I worry that it upsets the political apple cart
Oh, I know it does.
too much. And I'm more concerned about getting, speaking of this thing on, getting the, you know, the whiff created and setting ourselves up for success come this, you know, come the spring ballot initiative. So that's kind of where my focus would be right now. And we can always, I mean, we could always, you know, be doing like a community survey or, you know, like hear what, you know, find out, do we have people, I mean, do we even have like an application for hardship for people right now, Dan, in terms of paying their taxes?
Well, that's governed by state law. So we have a little bit of an ability to do stuff for folks, particularly elderly folks that fall into a particular financial demographic. But once you fall behind in your taxes, we do have very limited ability to assist at that point. So it's problematic for sure.
I guess the question is, do we have some way, to Robert's point, of measuring
Ain?
or some kind of property tax relief?
Well, like I said, we do run the numbers on how many it's not rebates isn't the right term, but certain elderly and veterans, disabled veterans, and they have a handy, I don't know, it's an exemption on that, and we have to fund that liability. And we generally run a number every year as to how many people qualify for the program and how much money we're expending to prop it up. But that is a very small percentage of the entire taxpayer base in the town of Yarmouth.
Dan, we can't even really use where we are on collection of taxes right now because
That's a problem. That's correct.
we can't use that as a measurement because
Yeah, collections of taxes right now is way off from what it would normally be in a normal year. So we've got to be kind of mindful of, are people just not paying because they don't have any money? Are they late paying? But we are a bit off on collection of property tax right now.
we get off. We were at like 5 million unpaid.
Yeah, I want to say it closed the gap a little bit. We're closer to 99%, but I think we're now about 96%. So that's a real millions of dollars. That's true.
But I mean, I do think that to Robert's point about needing to understand the motivation of town meeting voters when they say no, what is the motivation behind that? Keeping our finger on the pulse of the community, especially as we are, you know, looking over the selectmen's goals, you know, looking at re-upping, and I've seen a huge uptick in the town's social media presence and whatnot. Like, it's not that complicated to create a survey monkey, to push it out to the community that's anonymous, that allows people to say, you know, do it at a point in time. How are you doing financially? Do you anticipate being able to pay your property taxes? Do you need some kind of assistance? What kind of assistance do you need? I mean, I think it's important for us to know this just in general, not necessarily to even inform this decision.
So does anyone want to put anything in a form of a motion? George, wastewater?
Dan was suggesting something.
Want to throw an idea out at us, Dan, and we'll see.
Yeah, so I wrote, one of them would be, I'm gonna try to break this down into easy digestible statements. The Finance Committee supports continued wastewater planning either through DHY or on its own.
Right.
Does that capture it?
Yeah, I think so. we're just trying to say, this is an important project, and we're backing it,
Yep.
and we're flexible about how we're financing it.
So Brian made a motion to support
Second.
it. Jack seconded it. Looking around, seeing if there's any comment.
No, all in favor, I'm in favor.
All right, then I'm gonna do a roll call vote. Let's do Brian. Aye. Tara.
Aye.
Stephanie.
Aye.
Jack.
Aye.
Nate.
Aye.
George.
All right,
Do we not want to talk about the $100,000?
Well, so I got that as another one. That's
Okay.
my part two. Ready? The Finance Committee supports moving forward with the $100,000 CPA exemption in the establishment of the wastewater infrastructure investment fund.
So moved.
Seconded. That's a Stephanie and a Brian. All right, we'll look around for any other comments. Seeing none, we'll do a roll call. Brian. Tara.
Aye.
Stephanie.
Aye.
Jack.
Aye.
Nate.
Aye.
George.
all right.
Myself, aye.
Okay, so my last one for you, I'm going to leave it kind of open-ended to see how you want to finish it, but it says, the Finance Committee supports deferring CPA payments for a period of time to give you a tax break or to finance wastewater, or do you want to just leave it like that?
I thought it was to say, investigate the concept. It's not, I'm not saying that we should cut it. I'm saying the concept is to get a
So if
feel.
I say, the Finance Committee supports investigating the concept of deferring CPA payments for a period of time.
It's appeal to the taxpayers. Right, right. No, this is
Just
if-
what we should be doing is.
my concern is that we have not really identified how much suffering there really is out there on taxpayers yet, because none of us really know. And if we don't prepare, this is just like the other thing, preparing for a mechanism that we hope we don't need, but if we did, we started to prepare for it.
All right, so let me give that again. Let me try that again. So the Finance Committee supports exploring the concept of deferring the CPA payments for a period of time to assist taxpayers during this COVID-19 period.
If financially prudent. Something you could even add, like, I don't care how many caveats there are on there, but
Then I'll get rid of the the COVID-19 and just say if financially prudent.
That's better.
does anybody support that?
Yeah,
that
I'll
is-
support it.
All right, that's a Nate. With a-
Yeah.
Dan, can you repeat it?
So the Finance Committee supports exploring the concept of deferring CPA payments for a period of time to assist taxpayers if financially prudent.
So this is very just investigatory at this point. It is not a commitment either way.
That's correct.
Yeah.
I mean, it would still need a ballot question, just so you know, it still needs to do the same process, go to town meeting and get a ballot question. So it's,
Long way out and getting any traction, I understand.
yep.
Brian will second it.
I-
You wanna make a comment?
Yeah, I'll be voting against that. I would feel more comfortable with some kind of motion about investigating the financial security of taxpayers, full stop. But I think this is a can of worms that politically we don't need to open until we have a little bit more information to start with. And I can't support it. I'm sorry.
No, we'll look through the whole thing. Does anyone else have a comment they would like to make?
My only concern is that the phrase for the benefit of taxpayers or whatever that was. I mean, what we're really doing is giving the town some flexibility, another source of revenue, right? I mean,
Well, I think Robert doesn't want to collect it anymore, puts money back in the taxpayer's pocket.
Wastewater, if it becomes that, if in fact, people are voting their pocket and they see wastewater as being an increase, we don't at the same time offer them maybe not a break even for the first 300,000, but a more equitable break even, we'll get the support we need. In my opinion, if wastewater fails, we're gonna make another 15-year mistake. And it's gonna haunt us for so long. Another potential carrot, exactly, to get support. But not easily applied. You know what I mean? This is again to investigate it.
Yeah, I just think with the timing of fall town meeting,
I get it.
it's potentially setting up the previous motion for failure at town meeting. And I also think, you know, we're leaving matching money on the table, which with real estate sales being as high as they are, you know, as much as they are, I think, you know, that benefits the taxpayers too. There is, I'm just not ready to throw out the CPA, you know, and I know that we're just exploring it, but I think that we can do preliminary exploring by just doing a basic survey of town residents without going to that next step.
Any other comments? Do you want to change the last words on that a little bit more, or?
Are you asking me?
Well, I was asking George if you wanted to settle the last.
My reservation is that we're essentially denying revenue to the town, right?
Yeah.
This is just something that's carved out at 3% and goes to specified purposes. If we're going to withdraw that from the tax base, we have to put it back on, right? And putting
No,
it back.
so what would happen if you were to abolish the CPA tomorrow through a ballot question, the people just wouldn't get taxed anymore. We'd have no obligation to run the program anymore.
Yeah, but in 3 to 5 years, when you would be considering bringing it back, would it have to go through another ballot?
You have to do it all over again. That's correct.
Yeah, that's my reservation.
It says that it comes back, Dan, in 3 to 5 years as part of the article? Why would that?
You can't just reinstitute it. Everything is, if it's undone by a ballot question, it gets reinstituted by a ballot question.
It's done, it's being deferred.
Well, if you're going, you would have to actually, the WIF is different than the CPA, okay? So if you said that you wanted to put 3% towards the WIF, and that 3% is the 3% that's coming from the CPA, you'd have to abolish the CPA to fund the WIF.
That's not what I'm saying.
Can't do it that way. I'm not aware of any vehicle that would allow you to do that.
And that's not what I'm suggesting. I'm simply suggesting that at the town meeting that when we do the wastewater article, we allow for another article that's going to let the taxpayers say, I didn't get an increase in taxes at the end of this meeting. And that's all I care about if I walk out of the meeting knowing that I didn't get an increase. I'm sorry I didn't vote for wastewater, but if you had given me an option where it wasn't going to hurt me so much, maybe I would have picked wastewater.
Well, so, you can do like an informational question to town meeting to explore what their interest would be on a topic like that, right? I think you just got to kind of be careful how you phrase it, like, would you support a sum of money to support wastewater infrastructure trust fund as opposed to CPA funding? I mean, I think you got to be that kind of, give them that option, that generic, just to get what their temperatures are. If you're trying to get, hey, what's my overall level right now of taxation? I don't have any more capacity to be taxed beyond 3%. And that's why we did the 100,000, because that allowed us to keep that 3% number, if you will, intact more or less, and still provided maybe $680,000 every year to the WIF.
Yeah, I'm not perfectly all right with this. If this doesn't pass, that's all right. I just
No, I get it.
get it on the table for discussion. I think it would be good for the taxpayers to have their options. I hate not giving taxpayers options.
I just don't know, Robert, how you defer payment of an obligation that wasn't set up to be deferred like that.
And again, that's why I'm saying let's investigate it, because there's a lot of things we don't know about even how to pull that off if we wanted to try to.
Well, I mean, I could certainly within the next week get you a legal opinion as it relates to whether or not you could do that.
Right. Or is there a mechanism to do it? We don't even know that. I know that I've asked, can wastewater be added somehow to CPA? And the state has said no.
No.
Not without representation, senators and our representation.
Yeah, you have to change. So to your point, this is how you do it. So when CPA first came out, it was envisioned only as an open space situation, but then at the last minute, they changed the legislation to allow for the construction of park playground like amenities, and then also historic housing and whatnot. And then as time went on, when they realized that there was not enough money available to rehabilitate some infrastructure like historic infrastructure and recreational infrastructure, they tinkered with the law again to allow a certain amount of rehabilitation. I forget what the threshold language is, but now you can use the CPA funds to really, to gut what you used to have and build something brand new with that. And so they do tinker with the legislation. And I think it's been around 17 years. Maybe it's been tinkered with 3 times. So.
I did check into it, and right now they tell me there's no consideration for that at all, which is too bad, because I thought it would be nice.
Well, that's why, they established the WIF fund with a separate surcharge, and people are, I'm sensitive to being taxed, surcharged, and feed to death. I get that. But the WIF in and of itself, and we've been a 3% CPA community from the beginning, but particularly in those communities that never adopted the CPA or were less than 3%, the WIF option allows you to do some significant water infrastructure, whether it's wastewater, clean water, stormwater, and use that as an opportunity to incorporate that surcharge that would be available. Like, so for instance, I believe it was Sandwich did a 2 and 2. So they only added 1 extra percent beyond 3, but they went back from 3 to 2. We weren't able to engender enough grassroots support to do anything different than the 100,000. And even then, that wasn't particularly easy to get to that desire line either.
You worked very hard at pulling that off.
Yeah, it was. I got to thank Gary Ellis for coming over the finish line on that, because without his support, it's not going anywhere.
So I've got a motion by Nate and a second by Brian. Stephanie, you had a chance for discussion. Does anyone else have any more comments? I just want to move it along. Seeing none, I'll take a roll call vote. Brian? Aye. Sarah?
Nay.
Stephanie?
Nay.
Jack?
Aye.
Nate?
Aye.
George?
No.
Self? That would be a tie, so I'm voting in favor of it. So that's a 4-3 vote. The only other thing I had, and again, all this information was pulled together by me from Ken and Dan from our history. There's not really, any of this was my agenda. These are old things that were brought up, but that we hadn't resolved. The only other thing I had was, I opened up a little discussion for ME Small Manatees. It's on the selectmen's agenda to talk about ME Small. I think ME Small and Manatees should be joined together as a parcel, or at least address those together. It's almost 70 acres, I think.
Yeah.
I sent something out earlier that showed how few there were for properties in the area of that size. I think the town should investigate uses for that other than the CPA options, moving into a commercial application of 55 plus or something like that.
Yeah, so I think what you're trying to say is that you would support a motion that the finance committee consider recommending to the board that when we go to do something with that site, that we consider it in totality, the ME Small and the Matakey site. I made the conversation to the board that the site is more attractive together than it would be separate.
Exactly. And not to just pursue options of recreation, open space, typical things that we do, but to consider that as a site for income revenue or tax base to the town, such as what? 55 plus was the first thing that jumped into my mind. 55 plus is a great option. It doesn't burn the schools right out of the gate. It brings discretionary income, and it brings a mental source for boards and things like that. So
I'm sorry, I'm a little behind here in understanding how is the property going to be disposed of? I mean,
Yeah. So let me just kind of walk you back through that. So both Matakey's middle school site and ME Small Elementary School are situated, and actually both of those buildings are owned by the town. So right now, when the new middle school is constructed and Matakey's moves over to that building, the school department will be released from its obligation. Right now, they don't even have a valid lease on the school. So when they leave, pull up stakes, that building becomes our building situation. It becomes our asset. Again, it still is ours, but now it's like, what do you do with it? The other problem that complicates that scenario is they have an active solar field there that you'd have to negotiate with if you wanted to do something with that. They're generating power, so there's a contract obligation there that would have to be fulfilled. And then the other complicating feature here is it's been proposed that perhaps the best solution for the elementary school population in town is to build onto the Station Ave Elementary School. So some years ago, there was a design developed to add, I want to say it was like 8 classrooms to Station Ave. So when the new middle school was designed, it was designed such that it would accommodate growth of Station Avenue Elementary School. So the theory would be is we need to get a decision out of the DY school district as it relates to what their interest with Emmy Small is. There would be some that would say that to fix the roof, which is a real problem, that could be upwards of over 2 million just for the roof. We'd also have to seriously upgrade some of the other infrastructure to keep it viable. And I think there's less than 250 kids there. Wouldn't it make more sense if you were going to spend that kind of money to spend it on an addition at Station Avenue, which is a much more modern building, but also that would concentrate all your kids on one location that could accommodate that. By doing that, that of course would then free up Emmy Small as a building for the town as well. But that's out of our control because that's up to the school committee to decide what they want to do. But certainly there have been preliminary high-level discussions on that topic, and we're just not there at a point where we could say with any degree of confidence that that is a go or when it could happen. So
you're suggesting that under the condition that the school committee decides that they want to get rid of Emmy Small, under those circumstances, that we would recommend that the selectmen join those two properties together for
Investigate, once again,
some sort of
investigate the value to the town, getting that on the tax roll as opposed to just giving it to CPA or something for those uses. For me, it's really, what's the value of it?
yeah, so the process will be at some point, we present it to the Board of Selectmen to charge a committee to explore its reuse. So it's important to weigh in on what that language should be. So what I think Robert's proposing is that the reuse committee, I think initially you had requested that include a member of the finance committee to be part of the charge for the reuse committee, and also to ensure that uses that aren't CPC supported uses be also investigated. So that there would be an opportunity for economic development project there.
I saw a first run of people that were on the list, and there was no finance side of it really that I could see. It was recreation.
Yeah, finance committee, so we actually, just to get you a little bit more background on that. So that was a draft charge that was generated primarily with language from the Simpkins school effort. And I think maybe even from the beginning with Simpkins, there was a thought that housing was going to be its outcome anyways, or that was a desire. I could be wrong, but that's like my read on that thing.
So I would support that concept. I would not support language saying specifically over 55 housing.
No, of course not. Brian asked me an idea and I threw it on the table.
I think I can broaden this up a little bit, Robert, by indicating that the finance committee supports reuse of the potential site at Emmy Small and Mattakey School that would include revenue generating projects, if you will, something like that.
Yeah, I mean, let me also just say one of the things that I would like to talk about tonight and just put it out there on the table, and then we can kind of come back to this, is the first goal is to expand economic growth, development, and redevelopment effort to increase year-round employment, tourism, and quality of life. When I look at employment and economic development, I know of no business person who is going to start a business that employs people when they have no place to live. And so, you know, I think that a key part of any kind of strategic growth of economic development, as well as adding taxpayers, has to include just year-round market rate housing, as well as, you know, and not putting ourselves, you know, backing ourselves into a corner with, you know, over 55 or, you know, capital A. Like, we need to be also just broadly looking as a goal, as a community, at making sure that we have a workforce that can afford to live here. So that informs how I feel about this particular motion, which I, again, would support, but I support it through that lens.
Actually, Jack at one point said he supported that. So was that a motion to approve Dan's wording?
Yeah.
Okay, so I got a motion from Jack. Do I have a second?
Second.
Okay. Offering any bit more discussion?
Can you just read it one more time?
Yeah, read that, Dan. Will you read it one more time?
Yeah, so I'm gonna broaden this up a little bit. The Finance Committee supports the concept that the Emmy Small and Mattakey School sites should be considered, I gotta work on that, should be considered together and include revenue generating projects for reuse.
If the Emmy Small property becomes available.
Yeah, so the Finance Committee supports that the concept that the Emmy Small, and I'll put that in parentheses, if it becomes available. And the Mattakey School site should be considered together. And reuse of the site should include projects that generate revenue.
You okay with that, Jack? Okay, Jack still is okay. Are you still okay?
Is that,
Okay, they're both okay with it. So
okay,
I'm gonna say again, I don't see any other discussion. We'll go for a vote. Brian? Aye. Sarah?
Aye.
Stephanie?
Aye.
Jack?
All right.
Nate?
Aye.
George?
I,
And I'm aye. So that's everything I had on my sheet. I want to open it up to everybody on the board for whatever they may thought for the Board of Selectmen, that we should get in front of them if there's something. Okay, Jack says we've got plenty.
no, I don't disagree with Jack. He's a man of few words, but great wisdom.
All right, I'm moving on. If I hear no other objection
Well-
to, okay,
I do have a few.
okay, then
Yeah.
that's why I asked.
So again, going back to the first goal, you know, there's one, that employment issue, and then second, tourism. I understand wanting to support tourism, but I question the degree to which we can grow tourism. I think we've basically kind of hit our limit as far as we can grow, and we're starting to cannibalize ourselves, and we're a victim of our own success, I think, at this point. And really, we need to be focusing on diversifying our economic base outside of tourism. So I'm a little hesitant on this goal of increasing tourism, and it's a little from my perspective, if that it can be a little bit at odds with increasing year-round employment. I think we should be increasing year-round economic development and opportunity, maybe in addition to tourism, but if we're not focusing and making a goal of increasing year-round economic opportunities and development, then we're going to continue to have the life cycle that we've had of, you know, low-paying jobs, people not being affording to be able to live here, and this increasingly becoming a place that only the wealthy and retirees can live. And so I think that this goal, I would recommend that the selectmen, you know, include year-round housing and year-round economic development in their priorities for FY21. Because if you don't state it as a goal, then it's not ever going to be on the radar, and we keep doing the things that we've always been doing.
Let me see.
Are you typing, Dan?
Well, let me take a look at that for a minute here.
Let me chime in with a comment. I agree wholeheartedly with what Stephanie is saying. And I think we're at a unique time. COVID-19 has rendered living in one and working in one centralized space probably less likely. The one thing we need to make areas like ours attractive to people who want to start a business or businesses themselves is infrastructure like high-speed internet. And if the town were willing to support that kind of infrastructure development, I think there's an opportunity to attract new business in that fashion. 20 years ago, real estate in Midtown Manhattan was probably going to go through the roof. Well, I don't think I'd want to be holding any real estate, commercial real estate in Midtown Manhattan today. I think we've learned in the last 6 to 9 months that we don't have to congregate. This meeting in and of itself, being done remotely, allows an awful lot of what used to be done in those centralized locations to be done from places like Yarmouth with people who are all over the world. And look what we've got here: access to beaches, golf courses, pickleball courses. I think there's some wisdom in the town making itself available by building that infrastructure, which I'm not so sure we have right now. At least it's not readily available to everybody.
So when you look at like, I think we're all in agreement that that redevelopment is substantially hamstrung by lack of good wastewater capabilities. But to George's point, like with this future now upon us, I would even question the viability of large areas of retail space going forward, if they're even outside of supermarkets, say for instance. So what does that look like? And also perhaps even to some degree, the development of new restaurants. So what does that leave us with? And I think some clues there would be that if you were to build a incubator park or, for lack of a better phrase, business park of the future, it would be around internet access.
Yeah.
And the toilet, flushing the toilet and providing drinking water. I mean, that just comes standard concept. So the idea, and I've always been intrigued by the concept, and this is just so you know, I've spent a lot of time since I've been on the Cape trying to grow our infrastructure here, and we're going to be able to do a little bit of that. But it's hard to find concrete examples of where, when they put in this infrastructure, it paid, 2 + 2 is 4 dividend. I have spoke to a number of folks in this line of work. They all agree. There's plenty of anecdotes out there about that it does set the table for success. It provides this, but it is very hard to quantify that, to George's earlier points about quantifying something. Now, that being said, I can tell you in the communities in Massachusetts where municipalities have given their citizens a choice between municipal high-speed internet access through whether it's fiber at the last mile or whether it's a radio receiver signal and Wi-Fi, it becomes wildly more popular than the off-the-shelf Comcast or Charter or Cox operation. So let me give you for instance, and I've said this before, I have an account at my house that I own out in Western Mass, $69 for high-speed 1 gig service, been that for 4 years. The fella across the street from me just switched on a Comcast line, and he's paying $120 for 200 megs of speed. And that's the starting price at Comcast. So right out of the gate, I'm better than him by $60. And that's the forever gift. My rates are determined by 6 commissioners elected by their wards and then one appointed by the mayor in that town. So they don't look at a balance sheet and paying stockholder dividends to set my rates. They look at, are they paying for upgrade infrastructure, maintenance of the system, and what the customer service is, and then putting a little bit of money away for future planning. That's why my rate has been the same for 4 years now straight. And there's no sign that it's going to go up at all. But more importantly, I have a say on if it does go up locally. So it's a powerful tool. That to me is probably the single best argument to do a build out, is that it allows the municipality potentially to have a very powerful, controlled revenue source to do more wonderful things for its entire population, you know?
What Stephanie said and George said, I can say firsthand, doing this meeting here in the last 2 hours, I've gotten 6 flashes across here that I have bad internet service. And I've got Comcast. So I can firsthand, I can tell you, it's not the greatest show in town. Unfortunately, it's the only show.
That's correct. And that's an issue, right? And we won't get anything different than that if we don't take the bull by the horns potentially by the town doing something. That's a good, if you're going to put a stick in the ground on that number one topic, how best to expand economic potential of the town. If we're all in agreement that it is through a robust internet cost-effective scenario, the best way to go forward is through a town-led activity. There's plenty of examples across the Commonwealth of communities doing exactly what we desire to do, you know.
Well, if we threw that one out at the selectmen and, it went to town meeting, about 95% of the people that come to town meeting probably have lousy internet. So that ought to be an easy one to fund.
I don't disagree with you, Nate. And I think what you're going to find out is that between the internet connectivity problems, but just in general, their displeasure with an entity that was supposed to be a little bit more cost effective than it has been.
Yeah.
And a bad customer service rap.
Yeah.
But
I mean, that should be an easy win if you throw it out at the selectmen and then to town meeting. I mean, the selectmen got to have internet. And they've got to have the same problem, and they got to be paying the same prices.
So one of the things that, the government will pay for, particularly at the state level, is continued build out of a municipal network. So we're trying, we've begun with our first round of grants to build out a fiber optic line amongst town facilities. And from there, then you can branch out into neighborhoods if you wanted to. So when you look at like where would be the best expenditure of the dollars associated with that, you'd look at a couple places. Where can I get easy? And when I use the word easy, it's not easy, but it's where am I more likely to get some quick cash to do that? One of them is to continue to build around town buildings and connect town buildings, and then you can pick up all the neighborhoods in those lines. And the other area is in the economic disadvantage areas of the town that are presently identified within our census tract for community development block grant funding. So that funding can be used as an economic justice funding source to pay for a build out in those neighborhoods. So we certainly are going down the idea of modeling what we can do and getting some cost estimates down the line for that. That makes doing a townwide effort far more feasible than it would be if you just started somewhere from scratch. So
Dan, you've got, that's on the selectmen's number 2 list on maintain high quality infrastructure. Certainly we could reference that in regards to, it being important under category number 1.
Yeah, I think that's important to take for that, Stephanie, because they've never really looked at high-speed internet as infrastructure, because I think outside of a few folks, their familiarity with that capability was through TV programming, but certainly now since COVID-19 has occurred, it's really brought it to the forefront of people's mindset that, you know, there's a better way out there and it's within our grasp, no question.
Well, and I think it dovetails nicely with our conversation about having a pay for any kind of, you know, capital funds, but my preference would be wastewater. But, you know, as we've kind of discussed offline, within 5 to 10 years of investment in a municipal broadband system, you know, we can be earning money that, you know, as a revenue source to pay for some of these capital needs that we have.
Why don't I do this then? Why don't we propose under item number 2, you know, something along the lines of the Finance Committee supports the investment in the development of a municipally operated high-speed fiber network for future economic growth activities. Something along those lines?
Revenue generation. And revenue generation. Dan.
Yeah, okay. Let me,
I agree with this and I like the direction that this conversation is going, but I'm a little worried, Stephanie, that this narrows what your initial proposal was a little bit. Like your initial thought was something that was a lot more broad than just high-speed internet. So I just want to make sure we don't like close the door on your initial concept, which is something that's very important to me and that I also support.
I agree. I was going to circle back to that.
what if I drawn it up to something along the lines of that? I think this might hit that desire point, Sarah. The Finance Committee supports the town's efforts in developing a municipally operated fiber utility that would support future economic growth.
But I think the point is like, I do like the idea of specifically pointing out high-speed internet because that is very important, but I also think that there needs to be some provision in there to like just ways of supporting economic growth just generally, not specific to internet, just like to broaden it. I mean, like very broad concept here. But I think that if the Finance Committee is saying that we support recommending the investigation of a high-speed internet, that there's a way to phrase it so that you can language along the lines of like economic growth, including but not limited to supporting and investigating installation of a high-speed internet connection.
Yeah, and I think it also goes back to the idea that this needs to be part of, you know, again, like Sarah's saying, giving a specific example of broadband, I 100% support that idea, but the original concept is looking at number 1, that the goal for the town should be to increase not only year-round employment, but year-round economic development opportunities, including year-round housing opportunities. Those things are tied hand in hand. We're not going to, you know, build a broadband infrastructure that allows, you know, people to just sort of work from home and have that create jobs and a viable community that is sustainable. We need to also make sure that a Savant, like in Hyannis, or a Zudi in Harwich, you know, has the ability to grow here. And maybe that is related to broadband, but it's also related to their ability to find, you know, a workforce. You know, 0.9% of Barnstable County's housing stock is available for sale right now because the demand is so high and the stock is so low. So if we don't make housing, you know, a priority, then no business owner can succeed aside from that person who's just working from home like I am. And for us to have a viable year-round community where we're able to achieve our goal of shifting the tax burden away from, you know, retiree, you know, homeowners onto a commercial tax base, we need to be thinking of like business people. And I'm a business person, and I can tell you, I would not start a business here employing people here if I knew that I'd have to pay them $30 or $40 an hour just so they could afford their housing. So I think that broadly, we need to include year-round economic development and not be so focused so narrowly just on tourism. And we need to also include year-round housing opportunities as ways to achieve economic growth that is sustainable for this community and that achieves our revenue generation goals.
Well, so on like part one of this, then let's try to break this down into manageable pieces here. So is it true to say that the finance committee supports the town further investigate the development of a municipally operated fiber utility that would support future year-round economic growth in a housing opportunity? Would you want to try to surmise it like that, or keep housing separate from this effort?
Well, where are you proposing having it?
Well, so the goals are already set. So what the conversation tonight was on financial policy associated with setting the budget. But certainly I'm willing to, with Robert next board meeting to say, on a secondary note, the finance committee has weighed in on the goal setting that's been done, and they would like to have for consideration the inclusion of X, Y, Z, whatever that might be. It's not too late to do that, or have the board consider that potentially.
Dan, can you reread what you just said?
So this was in an effort to isolate the fiber optic.
No, I know. Read it with the fiber.
Yeah, the finance committee supports that the town further investigate the development of a municipally operated fiber utility that would support future year-round economic growth.
So what I think you should do is replace fiber activity with like something along the lines of infrastructure support for this is usually what I do on my desk. I think about things for 20 minutes before actually proposing it. So like the finance committee supports investigating like opportunities to support economic growth and year-round housing on Cape Cod, including but like not on Cape Cod in Yarmouth, including but not limited to investigation of a broadband of the fiber optic internet. Like stick it at the end as a suggestion instead of like as the main proposal.
All right. So are you at a keyboard?
No. Sorry.
Is anybody at a keyboard? Oh, let me try to see if I can get that.
Okay.
Keep that in the top of your head here. So the finance committee supports the town further investigate the development of
The development and support of, start again.
The finance committee supports that the town further investigate
Opportunities for
opportunities
for economic growth and housing development, including but not limited to.
Hold on.
Sorry.
year-round
Cut it out.
and year-round housing opportunities. I think it's important to have year-round in front of both.
I'm 30 words a minute with 3 less errors, but 45. So the finance committee supports the town further investigate opportunities for economic growth and year-round housing opportunities, which may include.
It's year-round economic development growth, not just year-round housing, year-round economic development.
Okay. Year-round economic growth and year-round housing opportunities, which may include the development of a municipally operated fiber utility?
Yes.
Actually, you could put the any small proposal in that category too.
Yeah, actually.
Okay. All right, so I'll go slow here. The finance committee supports the town further investigate opportunities for year-round economic growth and year-round housing opportunities, which may include the development of municipally operated of a municipally operated fiber utility.
That sounds great.
And the potential reuse of the Matikes and Emmy school site to further that goal.
I think that works.
Or that objective, I suppose we could say.
I'll make that motion.
All right, so let me read it just for clarity. All right? Hopefully I got it. So the Finance Committee supports that the town further investigate opportunities for year-round economic growth and year-round housing opportunities, which may include the development of a municipally operated fiber utility and the potential reuse of the Matikes Emmy Small School site to further that objective.
So moved.
Seconded.
Motion and a second. I'll open up for more discussion. Seeing none, we'll do a roll call vote. Brian? Aye. Sarah?
Aye.
Stephanie?
Aye.
Jack?
Aye.
Nate?
Aye.
George?
Aye.
And I too.
I would like to commend you all for that robust discussion because that's how it is that we end up with a better end product. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan.
Yeah, thank you, Dan.
Couldn't have done it without you.
I hope we increased your typing speed tonight.
You have. I got to work on my error ratio though, so.
You know, there's something called spell check.
I know. So. No, that's great. I think that that's something to that they'd appreciate that feedback and something that gives us some concrete direction for the future for sure.
Hey, Dan, it's getting a little late, but I'm going to open up to the board's consensus to say, do we want to have a meeting next week and continue with, I mean, I know Stephanie went through and did a pretty thorough look at the policies. Or do we want to continue to plow through, knowing this could take a little while longer?
No, I mean, if you want to go next week, I'm good with that. Maybe sometime this will give you an opportunity to review some of the stuff that we talked about tonight and all the other documents and come back to this. And we got time before the next meeting for sure, so.
I'll leave it up to the board.
I mean, I also just have questions that I could maybe talk to you about offline and not take up.
Or
the
just
whole-
email.
Yeah, like, I want to hold the meeting hostage. But I already have.
No. It's great, it's appreciated. I don't know, so have a meeting next week? I mean, we had penciled in anyways. You want to make it a meeting for next week for 6 o'clock and what's that, the 19th? Yeah.
Sounds good.
All right, so, Dan, unless we have a transfer or something,
Yeah, we do actually. I wanted to share that with you. That coupled with, you know, when we did the transfer for the IT group, we said we'd come back with some concrete examples of what the transfer was for. I have about $200,000 of that I'll send to you for consideration for the next meeting. I don't have it readily handy. I'd share it with you tonight. But the idea there is that we went back into the budget. We found the things that Rich was talking about, and we're ready to execute on that. But I'll have it for you for next week. But for tonight, though, I do have a kind of an immediate need that popped up on DPW's front. So they're requesting a transfer of the sum of $38,372.33 from a former West Yarmouth Library and Council on Aging HVAC repairs account to go to the account for various town buildings HVAC. Simple transfer. That allows us to free up that money that's not needed over there to pay for other problems we have with our heating and cooling infrastructure.
okay, so if anybody, you know, previously we've done a $50,000 flat fee, I think, you know, Dan, for HVAC.
Yeah, we've been doing articles of that sum for various buildings, but we're at the point now, we've got some significant failures we're trying to cope with.
Right, so this is a transfer into that account, which is just pays for HVAC repairs. for the
That's right.
buildings. Looking for a motion to support that? Jack, motion, second?
Second.
Stephanie gave us a second. All right, looking for more discussion, seeing none. Brian? Aye. Jack?
Aye.
Stephanie?
Aye.
Sarah?
Aye.
Nate?
Aye.
George?
Aye.
And I also.
Thank you. Like I said, I'll have the other pieces for the IT component for your next meeting. Those will go out in an email shortly, tomorrow probably. That's all I've got for tonight for the group.
Looking for maybe a motion to adjourn?
I'll move we adjourn.
Jack, motion.
Second.
Sarah, second. We need a roll call to adjourn, Jack?
Yes, we do. Yep.
Jack,
Aye.
Brian? Aye. Stephanie?
Aye.
Sarah?
Aye.
George?
All right.
Dave?
Aye.
And I.